Look at you, Fiona. You're leaving exactly the way I found you. Pathetic and penniless. John West's voice boomed, a jagged blade of sound that echoed off the cold marble of the courthouse corridor. He stood tall, his tailored suit worth more than most people's homes, his hand possessively gripping the waist of a woman with vibrant purple hair and a smug, knowing grin. John thought he had reached the summit. He thought the woman standing before him, his pregnant wife in a worn trench coat, was a broken shell he could finally discard. But he hadn't checked the morning's filings. He didn't know that the silver Maybach idling at the curb didn't belong to a high-end car service, but to the personal security detail of the sterling global empire. John was about to discover that the quiet girl from nowhere had a bloodline that could swallow his world whole. Dear viewers, this is the story of a woman who was kicked while she was down, only to discover that the man who claimed to be her past was the biggest threat to her future. It is a story of how a single act of cruelty intended to crush a woman's spirit became the very spark that burned down a billionaire's empire. Hello family, welcome back. Before we begin, I have a small but heartfelt request. Please subscribe. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. Every time you click that button, you're helping us share voices that would otherwise be forgotten, voices like Fiona's, and stories that deserve to be heard. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from. Because together, we are not just telling stories. We are keeping hope alive. Now let's begin. The humidity in the high-rise felt like a physical weight, pressing down on the sterile perfection of their living room. Outside, a storm was brewing, the sky a bruised purple that matched the shadows under Fiona's eyes. Behind her, the sharp thud of a heavy suitcase hitting the floorboards made her flinch. Are you even listening to me, Fiona? John's voice was cold, a clinical tone he usually reserved for firing underperforming contractors. Fiona turned slowly. Her husband, the king of real estate, stood by the door. At his feet sat her old, battered suitcase, the one she had hidden in the back of the closet for 4 years. I heard you, John, she said, her voice a mere whisper against the rumble of thunder. She instinctively placed a hand over her slightly rounded stomach. You're throwing me out? Tonight? I'm not just throwing you out, I'm upgrading. John checked his Patek Philippe, the metal gleaming under the recessed lighting. Misty is moving in within the hour. She's carrying the next generation of the West legacy. I won't have her breathing in the stagnant energy of a woman who has no drive, no name, and apparently, no use to me anymore. The mention of Misty, the creative consultant he'd been parading around for months, sent a chill through Fiona that the building's climate control couldn't touch. She's 4 months along, Fiona stated, the betrayal tasting like copper in her mouth. A boy, John smirked, adjusting his silk lapel. A real heir. Something your complications and your quiet lifestyle couldn't offer the West brand. It was the ultimate insult, a weaponized version of their private struggles. He walked to the glass-topped desk, grabbed a thick legal folder, and tossed it. It skidded across the floor, stopping at the edge of her worn shoes. That's the ironclad prenup you signed, Fiona. Article 8. Since you're the one being replaced for irreconcilable incompatibility, you leave with what you brought. No alimony, no assets, no claim to this penthouse. He stepped closer, looming over her. And don't bother looking for a lawyer. I've retained every top-tier firm in the city. If you fight me, I'll make sure you're raising that child in a shelter. Just take your suitcase and vanish. He kicked the old bag toward her. Fiona looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the man she had once thought was a visionary, realizing now he was just a hollow shell built on ego and her own stolen ideas. "You're making a mistake, John," Fiona said, her voice losing its tremor and becoming eerily still. "The only mistake I made was thinking a commoner like you could ever represent the West name," he retorted, turning his back to pour a glass of vintage bourbon. "You're dull, Fiona. You have no connections, no power, and no style. Misty, she's a star. You're just a placeholder." The elevator chimed, and 2 security guards stepped out. They were men Fiona had baked cookies for, men who knew her name. They kept their heads down, faces tight with shame. "Show Mrs. West to the service exit," John commanded without looking back. "And revoke her biometric access immediately." "Mr. West, it's a torrential downpour out there," one guard ventured. "Then she can use the suitcase as an umbrella. Get her out." Fiona didn't pack the designer dresses he'd bought to mold her into a trophy. She didn't touch the jewelry box or the vanity. She gripped the handle of the only thing that truly belonged to her, the bag from her life before him. As the elevator doors began to slide shut, she caught John's reflection in the dark window. "John," she called out. He didn't turn. "Goodbye. I want you to hold on to this feeling. Remember exactly how it feels to be the man who has everything." The doors hissed shut. The descent to the lobby took less than a minute. When Fiona stepped out into the howling wind and the lashing rain of the Seattle night, the cold hit her like a reset button. The rain didn't just fall, it punished. It lashed against the glass facade of the Obsidian Tower, a structure Fiona had helped conceptualize during late nights hunched over John's blueprints, fixing the structural flaws his ego was too blind to see. Now, standing on the sidewalk as the service elevator doors hissed shut behind her, the building felt like a gargoyle looming over her, cold and predatory. Fiona gripped the handle of her battered suitcase. It was a relic from her rebellion years, a piece of luggage that had seen the dusty backroads of Europe and the cramped dorms of her graduate housing, places where she had been Fiona Smith, the woman who wanted to be known for her mind, not her bank account. Now, it was the only thing standing between her and the wet pavement. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her leather wallet, her fingers numb from the sudden drop in temperature. She needed a cab. She needed a hotel. She needed a moment to breathe and feel the kick of the life growing inside her without John's voice echoing in her skull. She pulled out her primary debit card, the one linked to the allowance account John had insisted she use for household management, and walked toward the glowing ATM at the corner pharmacy. The machine whirred, a mechanical taunt in the quiet night. Transaction declined. Contact financial institution. A small knot of dread tightened in her chest. She tried her credit card, the one she used for her library fundraisers. Card blocked. She tried the emergency card she kept for car repairs. Invalid account. John hadn't just kicked her out. He had executed a scorched earth policy. He had spent 3 years learning her patterns, her dependencies, and her quiet trust, only to use that knowledge to amputate her from the world. He knew she had severed ties with the Sterlings. He knew she prided herself on being self-made. By freezing those accounts, he wasn't just taking her money. He was taking her ability to fight back. He wanted her crawling back to the lobby, begging for a bus ticket, proving his point that she was nothing without the West name. Fiona stepped back from the machine, the neon light of the pharmacy sign casting a sickly green hue over her skin. She opened the cash flap of her wallet. 2 20s, a 10, 2 fives, and 3 crumpled singles. $63. To the man upstairs sipping 30-year-old scotch, $63 was a rounding error, a tip for a valet, or the price of a silk pocket square. To Fiona, standing in a soaked trench coat with a baby who would need a doctor's appointment by the end of the month, it was a terrifyingly finite number. It was the price of a cheap motel in a dangerous part of town, or a few days of groceries if she slept in the rain. "Is everything okay, ma'am?" Fiona startled, turning to see a young man in a delivery vest, his bike propped against the wall. He looked at her battered suitcase and the way she was shivering, his eyes filled with a pity that burned worse than John's insults. "I'm fine," she said, her voice cracking before she caught it, hardening the edges until it sounded like the steel she was named for. "Just waiting for a ride." She turned away, walking back into the teeth of the storm. She wouldn't stay in front of the obsidian tower. She wouldn't give John the satisfaction of seeing her from his 42nd floor window, a tiny, drenched figure waiting for a miracle. As she walked, the weight of the suitcase pulling at her shoulder, the reality of her situation began to settle. John had likely already called Silas Thorne, his pitbull of a lawyer, to ensure that by tomorrow morning, every legal loophole would be closed. He would claim she was unstable, that she walked out of her own volition, that she was unfit for the very child she was protecting. He thought he had trapped a mouse in a maze of his own design. But John West had made a fundamental error in his calculations. He had studied Fiona Smith, the librarian, the quiet wife, the woman who preferred tea and old books to galas and gossip. He had never met Fiona Sterling. He had never seen the woman who, at 19, had looked the most powerful man in the country in the eye and told him she didn't need his shadow to grow. She reached an old bus stop, the plastic roof leaking streams of icy water. She sat on her suitcase, her back straight despite the exhaustion deep in her bones. She reached into the secret compartment of her bag, the one John never checked because he thought she only filled it with poetry books. She pulled out the burner phone, its screen dark and dormant for nearly a decade. She looked at her reflection in the darkened glass of the phone. Her hair was matted, her face was pale, and her clothes were ruined. But her eyes, the sterling eyes, were clear. John thought he had left her with nothing. He didn't realize that when you strip away the placeholder, you're left with the foundation. And her foundation was built of something much harder than his marble floors. She had $63 in her pocket and a kingdom in her blood. The sidewalk was cold, but it was the last time John West would ever have the high ground. She pressed the power button, the small glow of the screen illuminating the raindrops on her lashes. The war hadn't started in the courtroom. It started right here, in the mud, with a woman who had nothing left to lose and a brother who had everything to gain. The leaking plastic roof of the bus stop groaned under the weight of the deluge, sounding like a ship breaking apart at sea. Fiona sat on her suitcase, her knees pulled tight to her chest to keep her stomach away from the icy spray. She looked down at the burner phone in her hand. It was an old model, a sleek piece of sterling-designed hardware that felt alien against her waterlogged skin. For 4 years, she had carried this device like a lead weight, a tether to a life she had desperately tried to bury under the guise of being normal. She remembered the day she left. She had stood in her brother's office, surrounded by the glass and steel of Sterling Global, and told him she wanted a life that wasn't a transaction. Xavier had looked at her with those eyes, cold, analytical, and terrifyingly perceptive, and told her that the world was built on leverage, and that love without power was just a slow-motion tragedy. She had called him cynical. She had called him heartless. She had walked out to find John West, believing that a man with a humble architectural firm was the antidote to the Sterling bloodline. Now, with the rain soaking through her cardigan and her bank accounts reading zero, the memory of her own defiance tasted like ash. Xavier hadn't been cynical, he had been right. Fiona's thumb hovered over the power button. To turn this phone on was to admit total defeat. It was to tell the most powerful man she knew that she had failed, that she had picked a man who was a cheap imitation of the very sharks she had tried to escape. She thought of John's face as he kicked the suitcase toward her, the way he had looked at her, as if she were a piece of outdated software being deleted. Then she felt a small, distinct flutter in her womb. That was the signal. This wasn't about her pride anymore. It was about the life that didn't deserve to be born on a sidewalk because of her stubbornness. She pressed the button. The screen flickered to life, the Sterling logo, a stylized silver hawk, bleeding onto the display. The signal bars climbed instantly, bypassing local towers to hit a private satellite array. The phone didn't even have a keypad. It was programmed to dial one sequence. She hit the call icon. It didn't ring. There was simply a click, a hiss of encrypted white noise, and then a silence so profound it felt like the storm outside had stopped. Fiona. Her brother's voice was exactly as she remembered, deep, modulated, and entirely devoid of surprise. It was as if he had been sitting in the dark for 4 years, holding the phone, waiting for this exact second. "Xavier," she whispered. Her voice broke, and for the first time since the eviction, the tears finally came, hot and stinging against the freezing rain. "Xavier, I was wrong." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. She expected a lecture. She expected him to remind her of her commoner experiment and how it had ended in the gutter. But the man on the other end wasn't just her brother. He was the head of a dynasty. "Where are you?" Xavier asked. No judgment, only the terrifying focus of a commander assessing a battlefield. "The Obsidian Tower, on the corner of 4th. John. He kicked me out, Xavier. He froze everything. I have $63 and a suitcase. And I'm pregnant." She heard the sound of a chair sliding back against a hardwood floor. In the background, she could hear the muffled, frantic activity of a night shift security team jumping to attention. "Stay exactly where you are," Xavier commanded. The coldness in his voice had shifted. It was no longer directed at her, but at the world around her. "I have been watching John West since the day you said, 'I do, Fiona.' I knew he was a bottom feeder, but I didn't think he was a suicide case. To touch a Sterling is one thing. To discard one is an act of war." "Xavier, I don't want to just go home," Fiona said, her voice strengthening as the Sterling iron began to fuse with her resolve. "He thinks I'm a placeholder. He thinks he's built an empire on his own. I fixed his designs. I saved his firm 3 times over from the shadows. He's using my intellect to build a brand for his mistress." "I know," Xavier replied. "I have the files on his fraudulent loans, his offshore accounts, and the intellectual property theft. I was waiting for you to realize that you can't hide a hawk in a pigeon coop, sister. Do you want him handled, or do you want him erased?" Fiona looked up at the 42nd floor of the tower. The lights were still on. John was likely celebrating his freedom, with a drink, toasted by a woman who only loved his borrowed luster. "I want him to see who I am," Fiona said, her eyes narrowing as a silver Maybach rounded the corner 2 blocks away, its headlights cutting through the dark like twin sabers. I want him to realize that the nothing he left me with is more than he will ever own. Good, Xavier said, and she could almost hear the shark-like smile in his voice. The extraction team is 30 seconds out. By tomorrow morning, John West will realize that he didn't just kick out a wife. He evicted his own future. Welcome back to the family, Fiona. Let's go to work. The Maybach pulled to a silent, predatory stop in front of the bus stop. The door opened, and a man in a black suit stepped out, holding an umbrella over her with the precision of a soldier. Fiona stood up, leaving the $63 on the bench. She didn't need it anymore. She stepped into the leather-scented warmth of the car, the burner phone still glowing in her hand. The signal had been sent, and the storm was no longer a warning. It was the beginning of the end. The headlights of the Sterling motorcade cut through the torrential rain, like searchlights in a blackout. 3 identical black SUVs moved in a predatory formation, their tires displacing sheets of water that sprayed the sidewalk like the wake of a battleship. The lead vehicle pulled to a halt inches from where Fiona stood, and before the tires had even stopped spinning, the heavy door opened. Xavier Sterling didn't just step out, he commanded the space. He was a man composed of sharp angles and expensive wool, a living embodiment of the power Fiona had tried to outrun. Behind him, a phalanx of security personnel moved with surgical efficiency, shielding Fiona with wide, reinforced umbrellas and forming a human barrier between her and the cold world she had inhabited for the last hour. When Xavier looked at his sister, his expression didn't soften into pity. That wasn't the Sterling way. Instead, his jaw tightened, a silent acknowledgement of the war that had just been declared. He placed a hand on her shoulder, the fabric of his glove dry and firm. "You're shivering," he noted, his voice a low rumble. "Get inside. The heat is on, and the tea is waiting." As the door of the SUV thudded shut, sealing them in a vault of leather, silence, and the scent of expensive cedar, the chaos of the Seattle storm vanished. Xavier didn't waste time with pleasantries. He opened a sleek, integrated tablet, the glow reflecting in his dark, calculating eyes. "You think tonight was a surprise, Fiona?" he asked, tapping the screen. "You think John West is a genius who managed to hide his tracks from the world?" Fiona clutched the porcelain cup a steward had placed in her hand, the warmth beginning to seep back into her bones. "I thought he was careful. I thought I was the only one who saw the cracks." Xavier let out a short, humorless breath that was almost a laugh. "John West is a predator of opportunity, but he's a mathematical amateur. I've had a dedicated team on him since your rehearsal dinner. I didn't watch him because I wanted to interfere in your happiness. I watched him because men like John don't change their nature. They just wait for a bigger stage to fail on." He turned the screen toward her. It wasn't just a list of names. It was a digital autopsy of John's life. "We've been tracking the mistress, Misty, since her first private consultation at the hotel in Aspen 6 months ago. We have the credit card receipts for the jewelry he bought her using your joint household account. We have the logs of the offshore server where he's been hiding the kickbacks from the stadium project. The same project he's been telling you is over budget." Fiona stared at the data. It was all there. The late-night texts, the fraudulent wire transfers, the secret leases. John had been building a parallel life while she was at home, making sure his dinner was warm and his blueprints were corrected. "He thinks he's clever because he used a shell company to buy the condo Misty is moving into tomorrow," Xavier continued. his voice dropping to a dangerous register. What he doesn't know is that Sterling Global bought the parent company of that shell 3 weeks ago. Technically, John West is trying to move his mistress into a building I own. He's been living in a house of cards, and he's been doing it on my property. The realization hit Fiona with the force of a physical blow. She had been playing a game of checkers against a man she thought was a grandmaster, while her brother had already bought the entire tournament hall. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked softly. "Because you had to see it for yourself," Xavier replied, his gaze unwavering. "If I had pulled you out a year ago, you would have hated me for it. You would have thought I was the villain. I needed you to see the moment the mask slipped. I needed you to feel the rain, Fiona, so you would never again doubt the necessity of the fire." He swiped the screen, revealing a series of architectural files. Fiona's breath hitched. They were the designs she had redlined, the structural corrections she had made in the quiet of her home office while John slept. "He's been filing these under his own name for patent credit," Xavier said. "That's his biggest mistake. In the Sterling world, we don't mind a little infidelity. It's expected of men with no character. But intellectual property theft? That's a capital offense. He's been stealing from a Sterling, and he's been using those thefts to secure loans from banks that are currently being audited by my subsidiaries." Xavier closed the tablet and leaned back, the shadows of the passing streetlights dancing across his face. "Tonight, John thinks he's the king of the mountain because he threw a nobody onto the street. He's currently upstairs celebrating his brilliant legal maneuver. He thinks the Sterling signal was just a myth you told yourself to feel important." He reached out and took Fiona's hand, his grip like iron. "By dawn, he's going to realize that the Shadow Empire doesn't just move. It crushes. We aren't going to just sue him, Fiona. We are going to dismantle every brick he ever laid, and we're going to do it while he watches from the sidewalk." Fiona looked out the tinted window at the receding silhouette of the obsidian tower. For the first time in years, the fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical clarity. She wasn't just a wife or a mother-to-be. She was a Sterling. And as the fleet of black SUVs sped into the heart of the city, the weight of the Shadow Empire moved with her, ready to turn John West's victory into a ghost story. The penthouse suite at the Grand Sterling was a fortress of tranquility, a stark contrast to the rain-slicked misery Fiona had escaped only hours before. Here, the air was scented with white jasmine, and the only sound was the distant, rhythmic hum of the city far below. Fiona sat wrapped in a robe of heavy silk, a tray of untouched organic fruit and herbal tea on the low table beside her. For the first time in 3 years, the crushing weight of John's presence was gone, replaced by the clinical, protective embrace of her own lineage. While Fiona watched the steam rise from her cup, 3 floors below, in a temporary command center, Xavier Sterling was orchestrating a symphony of financial ruin. He stood before a wall of monitors, his coat discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up with the precision of a surgeon. He didn't look like a man tired by the late hour. He looked like a man who had finally found a game worth playing. "Status on Pacific Crest National?" Xavier's voice was a low, dangerous vibration. "They're resisting, sir," a lead analyst replied, his fingers flying across a keyboard. "The board is citing their long-standing relationship with the West Development Group. They know that if they sell their debt portfolio to us, they're effectively handing John West's throat to a guillotine." Xavier leaned over the desk, his eyes reflecting the cascading green numbers of the stock market's pre-market activity. "Then stop asking. Pacific Crest is over-leveraged in the retail sector. Start shorting their parent company's stock. I want their CEO's phone ringing with panicked shareholders by 4 a.m. Tell them Sterling Global is prepared to buy their entire distressed asset division at a premium, provided the West Stadium loans are part of the package. To the outside world, John West was a success, but to Xavier's eyes, John was a parasite living on credit and ego. The king of real estate had funded his massive stadium project through a series of complex, high-interest loans with Pacific Crest. It was a delicate house of cards that relied on the bank's continued patience. Xavier was about to buy that patience and incinerate it. The room was a blur of controlled chaos. Orders were being whispered into headsets that echoed in trading floors across London and Tokyo. This was the Sterling way. They didn't just fight. They moved the very ground the enemy stood upon. "Sir, we have a hit," a woman at the far end of the table announced. "The majority shareholder of Pacific Crest is looking for an exit strategy. They're terrified of the volatility we just created. They're offering to sell their controlling interest for a 10% markup on the current valuation." Xavier straightened his silk tie, a cold, predatory light in his eyes. "Pay it. I want the deed to John's stadium, and every personal guarantee he signed sitting on my desk by breakfast. I want to own the air he breathes and the dirt under his shoes." As the digital signatures were finalized and the wire transfers cleared across international borders, Xavier picked up a glass of sparkling water. With a single keystroke, the bank that held the lifeblood of John West's empire had changed hands. John was no longer a prestigious client of a local bank. He was a debtor to the man whose sister he had discarded like trash. Back in the quiet of the penthouse, Fiona felt the faint, defiant kick of her child. She walked to the window, looking out over the Seattle skyline toward the dark silhouette of the stadium, John's legacy. She didn't know the technicalities of the hostile takeover happening beneath her feet, but she felt the shift in the atmosphere. The Sterling signal had been sent, and the response was a silent, financial earthquake that was currently leveling the world John had built. She wasn't just recovering, she was transforming. The librarian who had been told she had no connections and no style was gone. In her place was a woman backed by the full, terrifying might of an empire that had just purchased her husband's future for the price of a corporate footnote. The rain continued to fall, but now it sounded like applause. The fluorescent lights of the King County Superior Court hallway felt like a spotlight on John West's impending coronation. He leaned against the mahogany wainscoting, a victor's grin plastered across his face as he adjusted his cufflinks. Beside him, Misty leaned in, her purple hair a vibrant splash of defiance against the sterile environment. She was stroking her baby bump with a calculated rhythm, whispering about the nursery they would design once the trash was officially cleared from the ledger. "It's almost over, babe," John murmured, his voice loud enough to carry to the small, solitary figure sitting on the wooden bench 10 yards away. Fiona sat with her hands folded in her lap, her face obscured by the curtain of her dark hair. She looked exactly as he wanted her, diminished, isolated, and draped in a coat that looked like it belonged to a different decade. When the bailiff called their names, John marched into the courtroom with the swagger of a man who owned the building. His lawyer, Silas Thorne, followed with a leather briefcase that supposedly contained the nails for Fiona's coffin. They took their seats at the petitioner's table, and Silas leaned over to whisper, "This will be a slaughter, John. She hasn't even filed a notice of counsel." The judge will sign the default judgment and the prenup enforcement before lunch. John didn't even look back when he heard the heavy doors creak open. He expected Fiona to shuffle in alone, perhaps with a court-appointed mediator who smelled like cheap coffee. But the air in the room suddenly changed. The temperature seemed to drop, and the atmospheric pressure shifted, the way it does just before a lightning strike. The sound of footsteps, synchronized, heavy, and rhythmic, echoed against the gallery floor. John frowned and turned his head. The first thing he saw was a phalanx of men in charcoal suits, moving with the terrifying precision of a Secret Service detail. They fanned out, flanking the aisle, their eyes scanning the room with clinical detachment. And then, walking through the center of the formation, came a man who looked like he had been carved out of obsidian and cold ambition. Xavier Sterling didn't look at John. He didn't look at the judge. He walked straight to the respondent's table, pulled out the chair for Fiona with a grace that felt like an insult to the room's meager surroundings, and then stood behind her like a monument. The silence that followed was absolute. Silas Thorne's pen hit the table with a clatter. His face had gone a sickly shade of grey. "Is that—" he stammered, his voice cracking. "Your Honor," Xavier's voice rang out, a deep, resonant baritone that commanded the very oxygen in the room. He didn't sit. He didn't open a briefcase. He simply placed a single, thin folder on the table. "Xavier Sterling, representing my sister, Fiona Sterling West. My firm will be taking over her representation, effective immediately." John felt the world tilt. "His sister?" he hissed at Silas, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "What is he talking about? Her name is Smith. She's a librarian from nowhere." Xavier finally turned his gaze toward John. It was like being looked at by a predator that had already decided where to bite. "Smith was our mother's maiden name, Mr. West. Fiona used it because she had the unfortunate delusion that she could find a man who valued her soul more than her trust fund. A fund, I might add, that currently holds a valuation larger than your entire development firm's projected earnings for the next century." The judge, a woman who had seen everything but this, leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Mr. Sterling, you are appearing as counsel?" "I am, Your Honor, along with a team of 40 senior partners currently waiting in the gallery and the hallway," Xavier said calmly. He reached into his folder and pulled out a document, sliding it toward the bailiff. "But before we discuss the dissolution of this marriage, we have a preliminary matter. We have just filed a notice of acquisition. As of 5 a.m. this morning, Sterling Global has acquired Pacific Crest National Bank. We are now the primary lien holders for every one of Mr. West's active projects, including the Seattle Stadium." John stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. "You can't do that. That's a conflict of interest. You're attacking me." "I'm not attacking you, John," Xavier said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more threat than a shout. "I'm foreclosing on you. You told my sister she would leave with nothing. You told her she had no connections, no power, and no style." Xavier leaned down, placing a protective hand on Fiona's shoulder. Fiona finally looked up. The quiet librarian was gone. Her eyes were burning with a cold, sterling light. "The thing about being a placeholder, John," Fiona said, her voice steady and clear for the first time in years, "is that eventually the Rayol owner comes back to claim the space. And I'm not just claiming the space. I'm claiming everything you used it for." The courtroom, which John had intended to be his theater of triumph, had become his cage. He looked at Misty, who was shrinking back in her seat, and then at Silas, who was frantically packing his bags as if trying to escape a sinking ship. The slaughter John had planned had arrived, but as he looked into the icy, billion-dollar stare of Xavier Sterling, he realized he wasn't the butcher. He was the meat. The air in the courtroom felt heavy, charged with the ozone of a shifting storm. John sat paralyzed, his face a pale mask of disbelief as he watched the Sterling legal machine move with surgical precision. But the true killing blow didn't come from Xavier's high-priced associates. It came from Fiona herself. For the first time in 4 years, she didn't wait for permission to speak. She stood up, her movements fluid and possessed of a newfound gravity, and walked toward the evidence screen. My husband, or rather, the petitioner, has built his entire reputation on 3 pillars, Fiona began, her voice projected with a clarity that silenced the room. The Obsidian Tower, the West Pier redevelopment, and the new Seattle Stadium. He calls them his trilogy of genius. He used these designs to secure the very loans my brother's bank now holds. She tapped a key on the laptop Xavier had placed before her. The screen split in 2. On the left were the official blueprints filed with the city under John West's signature. On the right were digitized scans of hand-drawn sketches, dated months earlier, filled with intricate notations in a delicate, precise script. John is a visionary of aesthetics, but he has always been a failure at structural integrity, Fiona said, her gaze fixed on the screen, refusing to even acknowledge John's presence. The Obsidian Tower was originally designed with a wind load defect that would have caused the glass to shatter in a high-altitude storm. I caught the error. These are my original calculations, hidden in the margins of my old sketchbooks. I corrected the cantilevered supports that allowed the building to stand. A murmur rippled through the gallery. John's lawyer, Silas, tried to object, but the judge raised a hand, her eyes locked on the side-by-side comparison. The West signature on the left was bold and arrogant. The math on the right was a masterpiece of engineering. Section 4. Paragraph 2 of the prenuptial agreement states that assets are separate, Fiona continued, her voice turning as sharp as a scalpel. However, Section 9 contains a fraud penalty clause. It specifies that if either spouse intentionally misrepresents their financial standing, professional credentials, or the ownership of intellectual property used to secure marital assets, the agreement is rendered voidable at the discretion of the aggrieved party. Furthermore, it triggers a total asset forfeiture if the fraud was used to induce the other spouse into signing. Fiona turned then, finally looking John in the eye. He looked small. You told me I was dull, John. You told me I had no ambition. But while you were at galas and late-night dinners with Misty, I was in our home office, fixing your mistakes so your legacy wouldn't crumble into the street. You stole my work, you filed it as your own, and you used those fraudulent filings to secure the very wealth you are now trying to shield with this prenup. That's a lie, John shouted, his voice cracking. She was a librarian. She doesn't have the degree. Actually, John, Xavier interjected, his voice a low, dangerous purr as he slid a new document onto the judge's bench. Fiona holds a master's in architectural engineering from MIT. She graduated at the top of her class under her maiden name, Sterling. She didn't tell you because she wanted to see if you could love a woman for her mind, not her credentials. It appears you couldn't even manage to value her for her work. The judge looked at the MIT transcript, then back at the sketches. The fraud was undeniable. The handwriting on the early designs matched the signature on Fiona's college thesis perfectly. John hadn't just been a bad husband. He had been a corporate thief, and his victim was the woman he had just thrown into the rain. "Mr. West," the judge said, her voice dripping with professional disdain, "your entire financial empire is predicated on the intellectual theft of your wife's labor. Not only is this prenuptial agreement hereby nullified, but I am freezing all marital and corporate assets pending a full forensic audit. You didn't just misrepresent your wealth, you built it on a foundation of lies." John's knees hit the carpeted floor with a dull thud. Beside him, Misty recoiled as if his poverty were contagious, her hand dropping from his arm as if he had suddenly become invisible. Fiona didn't smile. She didn't need to. She simply sat back down, the weight of the stolen years lifting off her shoulders, replaced by the heavy, satisfying reality of justice. She had been the architect of his success, and now, with a few quiet words, she had become the architect of his ruin. The aftermath of the judge's ruling felt like the sudden decompression of a high-altitude cabin. The predatory confidence that had sustained John West for years vanished, leaving him gasping in the sterile courtroom air. Within minutes of the asset freeze, the Sterling legal team had moved from defense to total liquidation. The court-appointed receivers were already on their way to the Obsidian Tower, and the digital locks on John's corporate servers were being changed by technicians he would never meet. John turned to Misty, his hand shaking as he reached for her arm. He needed the comfort of the woman he had traded his marriage for, the woman who was supposedly carrying his heir. But Misty stepped back, her eyes darting toward the exit. The adoration that had lived in her gaze when he was a mogul had been replaced by a cold, calculating detachment. "John, I can't be under this kind of stress," she stammered, adjusting her designer handbag, a bag John had bought with Fiona's stolen royalties. "The doctor said the baby needs a stable environment. This doesn't look stable." "Misty, wait," John pleaded, his voice cracking. "It's just a temporary setback. Silas will find a way. We still have the condo. The condo is owned by a shell company that Xavier Sterling just bought." Fiona's voice cut through his desperation, calm and melodic. She was standing now, smoothing her coat. "And the credit cards in your pocket? They were deactivated 5 minutes ago. You don't even have enough money to pay for the parking downstairs, John." Misty didn't say another word. She didn't offer a parting embrace or a sympathetic look. She simply turned on her heel and walked out of the courtroom, her purple hair disappearing through the heavy oak doors. She was a brand asset, as John liked to say, and she was moving on to a more viable market. John watched her go, a hollow sound escaping his throat. He was a man who had built his life on the appearance of power, and now that the curtain had been pulled back, there was nothing left but a small, dishonest man in an expensive suit he could no longer afford. Xavier Sterling stepped forward, a single crisp document held between his fingers. He placed it on the table in front of John. It was a standard purchase agreement, but the terms were anything but standard. "Your firm is underwater, John," Xavier said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The fraud penalties, the back taxes on the stolen intellectual property, and the immediate foreclosure on the stadium loans have left West Development with a negative valuation of roughly $200 million. By tomorrow morning, the city will pull your building permits, and the creditors will strip the copper from the walls of your tower." John looked at the paper, his eyes blurring. "What is this?" "It's an exit," Fiona said, walking over to stand beside her brother. "I am offering to buy West Development. The name, the contracts, the debts, and the physical assets. All of it. John looked up, a glimmer of hope appearing in his eyes. For how much? 10 million? 5. I could start over with 5. Fiona reached into her pocket. The courtroom was silent as she pulled out a single, crumpled dollar bill. The change from the $63 she had carried into the rain the night before. She smoothed it out on the table and pushed it toward him. $1, John, she said. That is the current market value of your integrity. It's also more than you left me with on that sidewalk. You can't be serious, John whispered, looking at the bill as if it were a venomous snake. Sign it, Xavier commanded, leaning in. Or don't. If you don't sign, we'll let the bankruptcy court tear you apart. You'll spend the next decade in depositions, and the decade after that in a federal cell for loan fraud. If you sign, Fiona assumes the debt, and you walk out of here a free man. A penniless, nameless free man. John looked at the sterling signature already drying on the buyer's line. He looked at Fiona, who stood with the quiet power of a woman who had finally reclaimed her own narrative. His hand trembled as he took the pen from Silas, who was already halfway out the door. With a jagged, defeated scrawl, John West signed away his empire. Fiona picked up the document and handed the dollar bill to John. Take it. You'll need it for the bus. As the Sterling siblings turned to leave, John sat alone at the petitioner's table, the single dollar bill lying in front of him like a tombstone. He had wanted an heir, a brand, and a legacy. Instead, he had been bought out by the wife he underestimated for the price of a cheap cup of coffee. The nobody from nowhere had just acquired the world, and she had done it without raising her voice. The seasons had turned 4 times since the morning the Obsidian Tower changed hands for a single dollar. On this particular autumn afternoon, the Seattle sky was a crisp, brilliant blue, devoid of the oppressive grey that had defined the night of Fiona's eviction. The tower still dominated the skyline, but it had undergone a radical transformation. The cold, reflective glass that once mirrored John West's vanity had been replaced by solar-harvesting crystalline panels that shimmered with warmth. At the street level, the intimidating private security gates were gone, replaced by an open-air plaza filled with maple trees and the sound of a public fountain. Fiona stood on the podium in the center of the lobby, her silhouette sharp and elegant in a tailored ivory suit. She moved with the quiet confidence of a woman who no longer had to hide her brilliance to protect a man's ego. In her arms, she held her 6-month-old son, Xavier Jr., who watched the crowd with wide, curious eyes. The space that was meant to be a high-end showroom for luxury condos had been gutted and reborn as the Sterling West Community Library and Maternity Center. Architecture is not about monuments to individuals, Fiona said, her voice carrying through the integrated speaker system she had designed herself. It is about the life that happens inside the walls. Today, we open a space that belongs to the people who actually build this city. The mothers, the students, and the dreamers who were told they were placeholders. In this building, everyone has a seat at the table. The applause was thunderous, led by Xavier Sterling, who stood in the front row with a rare, genuine smile of pride. Fiona looked out at the diverse crowd, the librarians she used to work with, the engineers she now led, and the families who finally had a sanctuary in the heart of the corporate district. She had used the Sterling war chest not to build a private fortress, but to create a public legacy. The penthouse where she was once told she was nothing was now a subsidized housing wing for single mothers. Outside the glass, across the street, and hidden behind the collar of a frayed, grease-stained jacket, a man watched the festivities from the shadows of a bus stop. John West looked older than his years. The sharp lines of his face had softened into the haggard puffiness of a man who spent his days doing manual labor on the docks, and his nights in a studio apartment that smelled of damp wood. He watched the jumbo screen above the entrance, which showed a close-up of Fiona. She looked radiant, powerful, and entirely unreachable. He saw the way the city's elite leaned in to hear her speak, and the way the common people cheered her name. He reached into his pocket and felt the single, crumpled dollar bill he still carried, the only relic of his former life he couldn't bring himself to spend. It was a constant, paper-thin reminder of the moment he had mistaken a queen for a pawn. A gust of wind caught a discarded newspaper at his feet, the headline detailing Fiona's latest philanthropic acquisition. John looked up at the tower one last time. He saw the logo of his former firm being dismantled by a crane, replaced by a simple, elegant S entwined with a W. He realized then that Fiona hadn't just taken his company, she had redeemed it. She had taken the hollow shell of his greed and filled it with the substance he never possessed. A security guard, the same Jerry who had once been forced to escort Fiona into the rain, approached John, not recognizing the former billionaire in his tattered clothes. "Move along, sir," Jerry said kindly but firmly. "You can't loiter here. But if you're looking for work or a meal, the center opens its doors to the public in 20 minutes. Everyone's welcome." John looked at Jerry, then at the doors where his former wife was stepping down from the stage to embrace her brother. He shook his head, pulled his hood lower, and turned his back on the tower. He walked away into the crowd, a ghost in a city he once claimed to own. Inside, Fiona felt a final, lingering sense of closure. She looked down at her son, and then out at the vibrant, bustling life she had engineered. She had found the normal life she wanted, but she had discovered that it didn't mean living small. It meant living with the power to do good. As the ribbon was cut and the door swung open, Fiona Sterling walked into her future, leaving the shadows of the past exactly where they belonged, on the street, in the cold, and out of sight. The architecture of her life was finally complete, and for the first time, it was built on a foundation of truth. Dear viewers, so, what do you think? Did Fiona and her brother Xavier, the man who wielded his billions like a blade, give John West the ending he deserved? Could you walk away from a life of absolute luxury just to see if someone could love you for your soul and not your bank account? And when that person fails you in the most brutal way possible, do you have the strength to reclaim your crown? Drop a comment and let me know. And tell me, have you ever been someone's Xavier? The one who waits in the shadows, watching the storm, ready to move mountains the second a loved one calls? Or have you been Fiona, the one standing in the rain, realizing that the person you trusted most was actually the architect of your ruin? We all need people who choose us, who show up in a fleet of black SUVs when our world collapses, and who remind us that our silence wasn't weakness. It was just the calm before the storm. If you love this story about a woman who was told she was nothing, only to reveal she owned the very ground her enemy stood on, about a CEO brother who redefined the meaning of protection, and about a mother who turned a symbol of corporate greed into a sanctuary for the community, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. I post new high-stakes revenge and redemption thrillers every day, and you don't want to miss the next time a nobody from nowhere reveals their true power. Like this video if you want more stories about quiet brilliance, about narcissistic empires crumbling in a single afternoon, and about sisters and brothers who rewrite the rules of justice. Your likes tell me you crave more stories about the unbreakable bonds of family, the kind that don't need a signature to be felt. This is Blissful Stories, where empires are won and lost in a courtroom hallway, where a single crumpled dollar bill can buy a man's dignity, and where the best stories begin when the person you underestimated finally speaks up. Until tomorrow, remember, never mistake a quiet woman for a defeated one. Sometimes she's just waiting for the sterling signal. Be someone's Xavier. Reclaim your Fiona. Change the narrative. Now go check your blueprints and make sure your foundation is built on truth.